Hi, if everybody's ready, we'll get started. My name is Courtney Smith. I'm the Deputy Director of Community Development here for the City of Tucker, and I just wanted to welcome you all to the first public meeting for our sign and overlay rewrite. We're excited all of you could be here. I know we've got some special guests here. We have Councilmember Matt Robbins, who may have just stepped out. We've got representation from both CIDs. Oh, there he is. We have our members of our sounding board who make up several boards and commissions. If you guys on a sounding board could raise your hand and be recognized, that would be great. Thank you. Well, the City of Tucker is very excited to get started on this project. Since we became a city, we've discovered issues with our sign code and our overlay codes. So we're really excited to have TSW here tonight. We've got Caleb, Sarah, and Alex here. They're part of the consultant team with TSW. I'll let Caleb tell you what those letters mean and then they stand for. But they're a great firm. They've done a lot of code rewrites. I've worked with them on other projects, and we're excited to have them work with you guys to get your input on both the signs and the overlay. So I'll turn everything over to Caleb.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and good evening. Thank you very much for coming out on a rather unpleasant Wednesday evening to talk about what isn't always necessarily the most exciting thing, zoning and sign ordinances. I wanted to go through very briefly what we're going to be doing tonight. As I told some of you when you came in, we're going to be having about a 30-minute presentation to sort of tell you where we are, what we've found out in the process. But then very importantly, we're going to break into a series of exercises where you, the stakeholders of Tucker, can give us some additional feedback that we feel is very important before we can actually begin the process of updating the codes and ordinances before you. As Courtney mentioned, I'm with a firm called TSW. We are based about 10 miles from here over in Midtown. We're a planning, architecture, and landscape architecture firm, and one of the things that we do is help communities update their zoning ordinances and development regulations. And so we've done this kind of thing in many peer communities, Brookhaven, City of Decatur, City of Snellville, and we're very fortunate and thankful to have been selected by the City of Tucker for this commission. I did want to mention, however, that we are not the only consultant on this project because zoning inherently relates with the law. We also have a zoning attorney, Cooley Land Use Planning and Law, who's also been helping us sort of behind the scenes to make sure that everything we talk about, that we consider is legal. So as Courtney mentioned, we were retained by the city to help the city achieve several project goals. The first thing the city wanted was sort of a third-party review of the sign ordinance, the overlays for downtown, the overlay for North Lake, and then the overlay for Mountain Industrial. They then wanted us to use that review process to develop a consistent sign ordinance that would ensure high quality, that would complement the city's development plans, and also asked us to do a technical cleanup, if you will, of the overlays to account for current development trends, and then very importantly to also make sure that they were easier to use. As part of that, they asked us to make sure that we read through every city plan, because as you'll see in a moment, city plans and neighborhood plans and area plans are the vision, and codes and ordinances are the tool. So we read through those. They wanted us to make sure that as we move forward with this process, we focus on creating things that are coherent, consistent, and straightforward. We hope that when this process is done, the sign ordinance and the development regulations and the overlay will be much easier to understand than they are today. And then, of course, making sure that we coordinate with several ongoing efforts that the City of Tucker is currently working on. So we're going to be doing that as part of a 4-phase process, and we are just at the beginning today, but that process includes a review where we read the ordinances from a technical perspective, where we talk to people who are familiar with the ordinances, many of those in this room and also others, where we think about best practices in peer communities that might be applicable to Tucker, and then of course this meeting, which we're calling a listening session, to help make sure that we truly understand what's important to the city. Based on that, we are then going to be working with you and the city to confirm directions. At that point, we're going to tell you what exactly we plan on putting in the new sign ordinance update and in the new overlay updates. We will hold a public meeting to make sure that direction is something you community stakeholders support. And then only after that, only after we know what the cities and stakeholders want in the code, will we actually begin the codification process, or the process of putting that into a legal ordinance. There will be a public meeting to review that. And then finally, once everything is hopefully ironed out, only then will the official adoption and public review process begin. So, with that process, I wanted to give everyone a little bit of background on some of the things we're going to be looking at as part of this process. I know from experience that folks have different levels of knowledge related to zoning and sign ordinances and the overlays, so I just wanted to spend about 5 minutes talking about one of those, about each of those. So, as you all know, zoning is the tool that the city of Tucker, really any jurisdiction, uses to regulate development on private land. It typically talks about permitted uses, building height, setback, and all of those regulations that shape the form of private development. The city of Tucker uses a variety of zoning tools to achieve that. As I'm sure you're familiar, the city has what we would call base zoning districts or underlying zoning districts. Those are all the colors that you see on the zoning map, and they range from residential to commercial to industrial. But then Tucker also uses overlays in areas of the community that are more unique. North Lake, Town Center, where we are today, and then Mountain Industrial. Now, it is important to mention that zoning is only one of the tools that shape the built environment. There are also things like subdivision regulations, stormwater regulations, tree protection, etc. But zoning is one of the basic and really the focus of this effort. And then, as was also mentioned, we believe very strongly that zoning should be a tool to implement your area plans, to implement your LCIs, to implement the work that your CIDs have been doing, and that visioning process really must be what guides the code. Now finally, relevant to zoning, I wanted to stress the fact that zoning is just a form of regulations. We can put whatever we want in zoning regulations, but at the end of the day, they do not force development. And so development in Tucker, as in any other community, is something that will be undertaken by private developers, private lenders, and willing land sellers. So even though we're talking about things like long-term density in certain areas, sign regulations in certain areas, all of those are really presupposed on only being undertaken when they make business sense for a developer. So I just wanted to be very clear about that we're talking about the tools. There is no actual specific development proposal on the table this evening. The other part of what we're doing, as I noted before, was to look at overlays. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard the term overlay before. Generally speaking, what it is a type of customized zoning district, for lack of a better term, in areas of the city where the current zoning districts are not appropriate. So, for example, if we think about Tucker, parts of the city like where we are today, where the current commercial districts may not include the architectural standards or setbacks that really match what the community's vision is for that area. They tend to include a bit more design focus, and they tend to include a bit more focus on achieving the neighborhood plan or achieving the vision of the area. Now, typically, overlays are laid on top of whatever the underlying zoning is. So a property may be zoned commercial and then have an overlay on top of it. Now, in the case of Tucker, you have overlays that are laid on top of your base zoning, but they in some ways also change what is in the base zoning. So as an outsider, it's a little bit confusing to know what exactly applies unless you work in the zoning realm every day, because you're subject to both the base zoning requirements and the overlay process. Now, the final part of what we're doing is sign ordinances. And sign ordinances are a little bit different from zoning. They're a little bit different from overlays, because sign ordinances are heavily regulated by federal law and state and federal case law. When we think about signs, signs are different than building heights, they're different than setbacks, because signs are really interpreted by the court as a form of speech. They are highly governed, as was mentioned, and also always are held to the principles associated with freedom of speech and freedom of expression. To that end, what cities can do in their sign ordinances are a little bit different than what they can do in other zoning. They can regulate the time of a sign, meaning when signs are appropriate. They can regulate the placement of signs. They can regulate what the sign looks like or its design, but the city cannot legally regulate content. So I just wanted to remind everyone of that, because our conversation this evening is going to focus on signs, but we really want you to think about the design, the height, the character of those signs, rather than the individual business associated with them. Now, with that said, there are certain obscenity laws that apply in the state, and that is the one case where the city can actually regulate against obscenity. But generally speaking, content is not something that can be regulated. Now, in addition, when we talk about signs, they really entail two parts. They entail the sign itself, meaning the marker of, for example, Best Buy in that image, but they also relate to the structure, meaning the larger stacked stone structure that those signs are on. Cities do have the legal authority to require closed businesses to remove signs, meaning the actual name of the business, but they do not have the legal authority to require the actual structure to come down. They can require it to be maintained, but again, the structure, the pole, the height, all of that is what we consider legally non-conforming. Additionally, those provisions apply to shopping centers. And so we just wanted to mention that at the direction of our attorney to sort of give a little bit of background. So with that said, what are we dealing with in Tucker today? Well, as was mentioned, there are 3 overlays that we're going to be looking at. There is a downtown one that is largely based on achieving the vision of the city's LCI. It includes 3 different zones. There's a neighborhood zone intended to serve the areas that are more residential and transitional. There's a corridor zone intended to serve major corridors, Lawrenceville Highway, portions of Chamblee-Tucker. And then there's a village zone, which really applies to the more walkable portion of Main Street. There's also an overlay for the North Lake area that is intended to codify the policies of the original DeKalb plan, although we will be updating that to reference the City of Tucker comp plan when we do this process. And then very importantly, the planning processes that have also occurred there. That particular overlay also includes 3 sub-areas. There is a high-intensity mixed-use tier where the most intensive uses provide. There is an office component, an office park sub-area or tier, and then there's an employment tier. And then finally, the other overlay we're looking at is Mountain Industrial. This is a relatively new one that was created to preserve the economic vitality of that corridor as a business address. And so it very heavily focuses on things like maintenance, aesthetics, upkeep, prohibiting certain uses that may not be appropriate, and is much more streamlined, if you will, than the other 2, because I'd like to remind you there has not been a comprehensive planning process for Mountain Industrial, so it's much more focused on more of the day-to-day things like use and scale. So that's what we have in Tucker today. What are some of our first impressions? Well, as Courtney mentioned, we've been working for a couple of weeks now on getting to know Tucker. The first thing we did was interview stakeholders, many of the people in this room, to find out what aspects of the overlays or the sign ordinance work well for them or do not work well for them. Because we believe it's very important to understand the community's perception of the regulations. In addition, we read through all of the existing plans to try to identify areas that may be in the plans that are not necessarily actually reflected in the legislation. And related to that, we also read with great care the existing regulations. We did that because oftentimes it's important to make sure that the regulations are actually being administered and enforced as written. So we read it from a very technical perspective. And we also wanted to make sure that it was clear. So we sort of looked at it from a third party and just tried to determine if it made sense to people who aren't familiar. And then finally, we looked at some of the variances, some of the zoning conditions that had been applied within the 3 overlays we're looking at. So with that said, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of our team's impressions about what Tucker is dealing with today, but more importantly, also tell you some areas where we need your input tonight, where we need your input before we can confirm direction. The first thing I'm pleased to report is that generally speaking, compared to many communities, your overlays are in extremely good shape. They tend to implement what is in the plans quite well. The challenges that we see are generally technical in terms of formatting, but they tend to be in very good shape. The sign ordinance also tends to do, for the most part, a fairly good job. It's, again, having looked at many sign ordinances, we see many that have constitutional deficiencies, and we're very pleased to report that everything Tucker has today is appropriate, enforceable, which is also great grounds to start on. The other thing that we've noticed from talking to stakeholders and that we've heard is that the application, the administration of the regulations has improved significantly since the creation of the city. We've heard that enforcement has improved since it was DeKalb County, that the city has been much more proactive in interpreting the regulations the way that the community wrote them when they were initially written. So again, that's a really positive thing. Very, very positive from the community perspective. But again, there are areas for improvement. We think that the text in virtually all of these documents can be clearer. We believe that there can be more use of graphics, particularly in the sign regulations. Unless you're a planner like me, you don't know what the difference is between a monument sign and a wall sign and a banner and a feather sign. So we think graphics can make it more user-friendly. We think tables can be incorporated. And then, as was mentioned, there's a couple of areas where we think they can better align with some of the plans in a very minor way. So that's an overall. In terms of the sign ordinance, what are some of the opportunities we see to improve? Well, I hate to say it, but Tucker has some pretty horrible signs today. You go around and some of the older signs are just, they're not the most visually appealing. And so even though the newer signs are better, we see an opportunity as part of this process to make sure that the design of signs is really up to the community standards. And that means thinking about material, thinking about landscaping around signage, thinking about how big they are, thinking about lighting, and thinking about other physical aspects of new signs. Additionally, there is an unusual provision in your sign ordinance, and I'm not sure where it came from, that says that signs have that the wider the street, the more right-of-way there is on a street, the greater the sign setback in base districts. And that is somewhat unusual. I'm still not sure where that came from, but that is one of those things that sort of as an outsider is somewhat strange. Usually signs are based on a fixed position. The other thing we noticed is that the city does allow A-frame and sandwich board signs in the town center. It's referenced in the mountain industrial, but there's no actually reference to that kind of sign in the actual sign ordinance. And so one of the things we want to ask you this evening is, should we do that? Should we develop citywide standards for doing that? And if so, how? Related to that, I think there's some opportunity to improve the temporary sign provisions. What is a temporary sign? Well, it's basically a sign that is intended to be put up for a short duration while a permanent sign is being created. Unfortunately, as you know, some temporary signs in Tucker have actually become permanent. And so that's another area that we want to work with the attorney to make sure that the city has enforceable regulations for making applicants take down the temporary signs or the canvas signs and truly replace them as we go forward. Now, of all the areas where we think the most work needs to be done, or we think the most public conversation needs to be had, it's about these little things right here. During the course of stakeholder interviews, almost every single person we talked about had some sort of comment about electronic message board signs. Some were very concerned about their brightness or their brightness near residential. Some were questioning whether they should be permitted in the city at all. And some were saying, well, maybe they should only be allowed in certain areas. So this is one of those types of signs that when we break this evening, we're going to ask for your feedback on. Because they can have, you do have regulations for them today. They are allowed in certain areas and there are certain illumination requirements. But again, we heard from some folks that maybe we shouldn't allow those, or maybe we should think about making them more restrictive where they can go. So we love your feedback on that. And then the final sign-related provision we noticed was that some jurisdictions have very clear standards for what are called public signs. And these public signs are typically things like community events, and they're typically in the public right-of-way or in a public park. And so one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this process is ask you, should Tucker create allowances for this? Should Tucker amend the sign code for banners over Main Street during special events, or banners in parks during special events? And if so, where? So that's a sign ordinance. Again, a lot of technical cleanup and a few areas where we feel that your input this evening could be extremely helpful. Now we get into the overlays. I'm going to be very hard on the city on this one, but the way the city regulates allowed uses in the overlays is extremely confusing. If you've never looked at the regulations, what they say is that there are permitted uses listed in the overlays. So for example, in the chart that you'll see outside, they're shown on the right. But if they're not listed in the overlay, you have to look at the underlying zoning to know if they're allowed. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems like one extra step. And so one of the things we would like to do this evening is we'd like you as a community to take a look at all of the permitted uses. Let us know what your thoughts are. We have 5 charts in the front area showing every single use allowed in every single overlay today. I'd like you to tell us if certain uses are inappropriate, because I think what may come out of this is separating the permitted uses from the base zoning and just having a single chart in one location that the city can administer and the applicants can know what's expected. But before we do that, we want you to take a look at it. The other thing that we noticed that was very unusual, and we're not sure of the history of it, is that your downtown overlay doesn't perfectly match what is called your downtown future land use, which is on the left. If you look at the future land use map of the city of Tucker, which is intended to be the long-term vision for different areas, the downtown area, the town center area, I think is actually called town center on the future land use map, is a bit smaller. Cowan Road is excluded, and a couple of areas to the east along Lawrenceville Highway are also excluded. That is very, very unusual, and I'm not sure why that was done. But one of the things we want to ask you about tonight is whether or not we should think about aligning the two, so that the updated downtown overlay or town center overlay actually applies within that area. So we're gonna ask you to think about that. The other thing that we noticed that is quite odd is there's a discrepancy in building height on Main Street between your newly adopted comprehensive plan and what is actually in the zoning code today. The comprehensive plan says that buildings should be a maximum of 2 stories. But the current overlay that was very carefully crafted with community input says 3 stories are allowed on Main Street. And so what we're going to ask you to look at this evening, again, when we break, is share your thoughts on that. We believe that there are ways that we can create new regulations that achieve both aspects. There are things such as we're building step up, there are other design provisions, but we just want to hear from you to get further feedback on that. We did talk to the consultant who prepared the comprehensive plan. She felt pretty strongly that that had come out of the process. So we think we need to figure out what exactly is the right approach before we can codify it. The other thing that's unusual in downtown is the way setbacks are regulated. Setbacks are sort of in various parts of the code. One of the setbacks, and the setbacks tend to be very, what I would say are one size fits all. There is a single setback provision along Main Street which says you effectively have to match whatever is also on that area. So you can be no closer than the closest building, nor further back than the furthest back building. That makes a lot of sense. But what's unusual is that on some of your other streets, you have a very wide range of 0 to 20 feet. And in the course of talking to stakeholders, it was suggested to us that there may be some streets, for example, Lawrenceville Highway, which is very, very wide, where the city wants to require a slightly wider setback so that buildings are not right to the back of the sidewalk, perhaps with landscaping, perhaps with outdoor dining. And so we're going to ask you to provide us with some input on that as well. And again, this is, I know this is challenging to see on the small screen, but this is really the question that we're going to be asking you to think about. Should we require some sort of landscaping or some sort of setback along those major corridors because they are just so very, very wide today? And that actually accomplishes several things. It creates more of a buffer, but it also allows areas where the trees can grow if you do want trees. It's very challenging for a tree to reach full maturity right adjacent to the curb, especially on a state of Georgia route. Now, in terms of North Lake, we had also heard some, although certainly not many, folks comment that the building height may warrant some reconsideration as part of this process. I wanted to point out to you today that in Tier 1, buildings can be up to 15 stories or 180 feet tall. In Tier 2, they can be 9 stories, and in Tier 3, they can be 4. But I did also want to say that as a sort of the third-party independent consultant, those tend to be pretty good numbers given what the comp plan talks about in that area, given that the long-term vision is to develop North Lake as more of an employment center for the city of Tucker. We feel those are appropriate, but we just want to hear back from you and get your comments. The other thing that was very unusual about North Lake, however, was that the code has some aspects which seem to be really unneeded today. And one of those aspects relates to a provision in the code for additional density. So when you look at North Lake, it says that if you do certain things, meaning provide mixed-use development, interconnectivity, public spaces, etc., you can get more density. Unfortunately, and I've confirmed this with Courtney, you don't actually get more density because the density is already established. So these bonuses are in there, but they don't really do anything. The code may have changed from when it was carried over from DeKalb County, but they have hardly any value, if any value, in actually achieving today. So one of the things that we wanted to think about was, should we keep them? Should we eliminate them? Or are there things in there that the city may just want to require? And one of those that I think would be very easy to require is interconnectivity between adjacent developments. That is something that almost every jurisdiction has. And today you get a bonus for it, even though the bonus isn't really achievable. The other thing we noticed about North Lake is that there is a very good provision in there that says new development has to have 20% open space. That makes perfect sense. It's very good planning. However, where things like that become a challenge is if I'm the property owner that may own a commercial outparcel today. And to redevelop a 2 or a 1 acre property and meet that 20%, given the city's parking requirements, given the streetscape requirements, I think it would be legitimate to say that that's really challenging. And so oftentimes, where we have a redevelopment scenario, which is really what we're talking about here, we have created in other jurisdictions customized standards for open space on smaller lots. Typically a little bit less because they do have less land to work with. And then the final aspect of North Lake that we really would like feedback on is Vista Dale Court. Now, does everyone know where that is? That is just east on the map of North Lake Parkway, and it's an older residential subdivision that actually is zoned for commercial and mixed use today. Courtney gave us the background on that property. It was actually rezoned in 1986 for a very large project that never happened. But it stayed what it is. So today when you go back there, you see a lot of these sort of older ranch houses that are occupied by businesses. So from a planning perspective, there's a very important question that we want to hear back from the community. Should that current character be preserved? Should the current allowance for higher density be appropriate there? Or is there some other scenario? We just feel that question, which we have a whole board on out in the back, is really critical to hear feedback on. And then the final area is mountain industrial. We've heard some suggestions that we might want to think about additional permitted uses in that area. Today, the uses are pretty much all manufacturing with some commercial uses. We've also heard some concerns that we might need to think about adjusting some of the architectural standards. When you read the mountain industrial overlay today, the only types of buildings you can build are all masonry buildings that pretty much look like everything in there today. And I understand why that was done. We actually had a role years ago in helping to write that. But if you think about what's happening in other parts of Metro Atlanta, you're seeing older industrial buildings updated. They're being updated for newer industries, they're being updated for laboratories, they're being updated for research. So there might be some materials that might actually be appropriate for North Lake, for mountain industrial, I should say. For example, buildings that have more glass on them, or more landscape provision and that sort of thing. So we have a whole series of surveys out in the entry hall where we're going to ask you to think about that. And then finally, related to mountain industrial, there is also one of those conflicts between the current mountain industrial overlay, which aligns with the CID boundary, and what is actually the mountain industrial character area or land use area in the comprehensive plan. And as you see on the map, in the comprehensive plan, Town Center or Downtown Tucker in red touches mountain industrial. Today, it doesn't, and you have a couple of instances of commercial zoning in this sort of no man's land. That may be perfectly appropriate. We just want to hear back from people to determine if that should change as part of this process. So in a nutshell, that's where we've been. That's what some of our initial observations are, and those are the areas where we want to get feedback from you this evening.